Welcome to our series of healthcare scene interviews where we sit down with top leaders in healthcare IT. I'm John Lynn, the founder of healthcarescene.com, a network of leading healthcare IT resources and blogs. I'm happy to host a panel of experts today talking healthcare interoperability. Before we begin, I want to remind those watching live that we'll talk for about 30, maybe 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Also, if you're joining us live on Blab, if you like what someone's saying, or if you just like that person, or maybe you just like Mario's beard, you can go ahead and click on their face and give them props. They always like that, and I know I do too. So giving you props. On the left side, there's an opportunity where you can tweet it out. You can post to Facebook. So if you want to share this conversation, we much appreciate that. Also, if you're joining live, if you have any questions during the chat, you can do /Q and then space and then submit a question. That will queue it up. If it fits within the flow of what we're talking, we'll try to include it right where in the conversation. If it doesn't, we'll definitely address it in the after party where we let anyone hop on and join. So if you want to join and ask questions or add to the conversation, we're certainly welcome anyone to do that after the first kind of formal discussion. So enough with the housekeeping items. Let's get started with some intros from our esteemed panelists. Let's start first with the man with the best beard in healthcare IT, Mario Hyland, who's the Senior VP and founder at Aegis, Inc. Welcome, Mario. Tell us about yourself.
Oh, thank you very much, John. Appreciate it and glad to be here. Enjoy supporting this topic very much. Interoperability is something I live and breathe each and every day. My Twitter handle, Interop Guy, speaks to how important I think interoperability is. And my role here at Aegis is to help the industry recognize some of the challenges facing interoperability as we go forward. I'll pause there and let my esteemed colleague, Richard Edameh, introduce himself.
Well, thank you, Mario. As Mario said, Richard Edameh with Aegis.net. I'm the lead architect for the Developers Integration Lab, which is the parent project for Touchstone that we've just recently launched. I'm also the author of our FHIR client and server that we host that supports DSU2 and the latest standard.
Nice. Well, I think Mario highlighted exactly why I wanted to have this conversation is because whenever I meet with Mario, and I first met him maybe 4 years ago at mHealth Summit in DC, it's like the guy just lives, eats, breathes, and sleeps interoperability. So I think this is a theme actually for the blabs that I do. I love to have people that's all they do and they just love it. So I'm excited to have you guys here with me today. I thought I'd start out the conversation with kind of something you put out in your press release about Touchstone. You said that Gartner last year had a top strategic technology was going to be scalable interoperability. And I love that they put it as scalable interoperability because, we've had some interoperability in healthcare for a long time, but very limited, right? It hasn't been able to scale across organizations. And in that press release, Aegis recognized FHIR as having that potential to address the challenge. So, let's start off with that. Why are you guys so excited about FHIR?
Well, so let's work with the term interoperability. First and foremost, I want everybody to recognize I don't believe we need to redefine interoperability. IEEE has defined interoperability as system-to-system exchange of information, where the receiving system is key. It understands the context and intent of the message it received. So with that definition, I think everybody is clear on how we ensure interoperability. We need to make sure that here's an example. If we know interoperability is a best practice and a road towards information sharing, then why is it that so many people that are trying to address interoperability are trying to and developing their own testing approaches? Interoperability is dependent upon adopting industry-based standards. And when we look at those industry standards, whether it's HL7v2 or HL7v3 or IHE or other standards out there, we always find that there is a consensus-based drive to write the standard, But what happens next is that we all take that standard, we return to our own organizations, and we interpret that standard through our implementation. If we do our own interpretation of that standard through implementation, then we use our interpretation to drive our approach to testing. And that's the fallacy. Rather, if we could, at the same time, we're together as consensus and we're talking about developing the standard, if we could develop the approaches that we're going to use to test that standard and test the implementation, and not only test the happy path, there's a term out there called the Robustness Principle. And I want everybody to follow this because it's only 12 words. Be conservative in what you send. That means follow the standard, adhere to what the conformant of the message is. But the other part of that robustness principle says be liberal in what you accept. Well, what does that mean? That part of that sentence means errors, exceptions. Be ready to handle when things are not ideal. And that is what we're trying to show and demonstrate to the industry, is that when you look at the testing that is being done today, challenge your vendors, challenge EHR vendors and others who are developing healthcare solutions to test beyond the happy path, beyond ideal data, and ensure that the systems that are being developed and pushed into production are going to have the rigors necessary to ensure that doctors and nurses providing care at bedsides are not going to be an extension of our testing team. Why? Because we haven't tested those workflows, and they are the first ones to encounter negative, exception, or error conditions. It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to our patients.
So do you think that, I mean, it's interesting that you're right exactly what the problem is, that everyone takes a standard and goes back and applies it however they want. I mean, is FHIR going to have that same problem, or is there stuff done to make it so that that's not an issue?
So you're right. Any standard will suffer the potential risk. But what's different with FHIR is Aegis. We're showing up to help the industry with our effort with Touchstone, where we're working with, and I'll have Richard go into some of the details around this, but we're working to build a platform that is open access, where organizations at the point of development can use TDD, test-driven methodologies, so that the entire industry is being, the thing I'd like to say? The entire industry is using the same testing approach to ensure their implementations are the same. And if there's a disagreement, then we bring the industry together, and then we'll talk about what that difference is. And if it's agreed upon, then we'll ensure that everybody is tested the same way. And by virtue of not only testing the current standards, but ensuring that we're backwards compatible, testing people against prior versions when required to support them, or to take a prior version of a product and be able to test it against the future releases of new standards. That's called future proofing. So, I'll pause there, and Richard, why don't you add on why we think FHIR and the approaches that are being taken both from the development of the standard, the reference implementation, and what we're doing with testing has a chance to ensure interoperability across the industry. Well,
taking that and moving forward, specifically with FHIR, the great thing about FHIR is it's the new kid on the block, but it's a new way of looking at defining how we're going to take the clinical information and put it into definable data elements that are consistent. So what FHIR is doing is essentially redefining how we're looking at clinical data. So if you look at the FHIR specification, we have the data broken down into discrete resources. And one of the great things about those is that all of the working group meetings with HL7 can get together, and they're all behind FHIR, and they're working towards defining what those individual resources mean within the working groups. And so there's a lot of consensus, a lot of input from industry going into how these resources are being defined. What we see with FHIR and what we found is one of the great things is you are able to define how to test right in the spec itself. So we're talking about a new resource type in FHIR called test script. And that's what we're actually leveraging within Touchstone. And that's what we're using to define how to test the specification. So built right into the spec is the means by which we can define how to test it. And using this, we can come up with an industry-wide, commonly agreed on way to test the specification. We can get input from all parties and look at a test script and say, this is how we're testing a patient resource, and this is how we define how we even look at the extensions, the additional pieces, profiling, and so forth. It's all there in that test script resource. So I'll pause there.
What's the relationship? So, I mean, you guys provide Touchstone to HL7, and then the EHR vendor purchases it, or what are the relationships there? Are you just trying to sell Aegis? I guess I guess.
So that's a
how does it work? Right?
That's a great question, John. We're right now providing Touchstone and the tests that are out there for free, and we're doing this to demonstrate to the industry that test-driven development, our approach, our methodology is sound. It will advance and accelerate software development. It will ensure interoperability. We have ONC trying to solve interoperability. We have high tech pointing to NIST to develop testing tools. And we have found that the industry as a whole has to wait on testing tools developers. Whenever there's a problem with a testing tool and somebody points it out, whether it's the direct testing tool, the TTT, or a predecessor to some of the newer tools coming online, whenever there was an issue, the industry had to wait. They had to endure that error over and over again for a while. So what we're doing with Touchstone is we've introduced, not only from the spec the specification perspective with the test script, but Touchstone has been built from the ground up to be a natural language processing testing engine. And we'll have Richard talk about this a bit more in a second. But the whole concept is we want to crowdsource. We want a testing platform that's its entire role is just to be the platform, the convener, bringing people together. From there, organizations and anyone interested in testing FHIR can help develop their own testing approaches from a test script perspective. And once those scripts are tested, then the entire industry can benefit from that. So we see ourselves as sort of launching something, but not taking on the entire responsibility of doing it all. Although right now, we are focused on trying to make sure we get FHIR off to a good start. John, do you want Richard to talk a little bit more about NLP, natural language processing, and why Touchstone?
Yeah, definitely. I'm interested to see how you integrated it, and what are the benefits of integrating the NLP into the testing platform?
Well, so if you think about, let's say you're a vendor and you're implementing a FHIR client, server, some type of adapter, some type of interface, and you want to test it out. You may go back and tell your team, well, go build me a test platform that exercises what we're building here. The problem is, if they put it together, let's say with a programming language, Java, Groovy, whatever, Ruby, that is something that has to be maintained as an application for testing. So instead of doing it that way, if we had a defined definition of what a test is in a natural language parsable resource like the test script, now you've abstracted that functionality away from coding. We have a test engine where we've validated that it's executing things according to the spec, and we're then looking at the test script as the definition of how to execute various operations according to the FHIR spec, using conformant resources, even using non-conformant resources because we want to test that negative. We're looking for error conditions, but now we're taking the burden of maintaining a testing environment in a programming language, and we're moving it off to a defined resource, a defined natural way of thinking about it. It's in XML, it's in JSON, whatever FHIR is supporting. And so you can actually build an editor, if you will, that helps you define how to do this. I mean, if you want to write XML by hand, you can do that, which I've done a lot of. But the idea is that now you're providing non-developers, non-programmers with that capability of being able to define their tests without having to write out specs and say, this is what I want it to do, and now they have to wait for a programmer to come along or a development team to actually implement it.
And I saw one question go by, John. I want to jump in here for just a second. There are a lot of ways to test a system, and all of those tests need to be done, whether it's a UI-based test, whether it's usability, user experience, workflow. What we're representing here and what we're talking about today is interoperability. It is the message-based exchange of information in a clinical setting where care coordination across multiple organizations need to happen. I want to tell the world, we are not a silver bullet. We cannot solve all of the problems. There are a lot of different testing that needs to happen. You're right. There's a lot of user experience and usability issues within EHRs today. That's not where Aegis is currently focused. Our specific focus is to make sure that whatever EHR products or healthcare-related systems, integrated products are being bought or platforms being stood up, that those solutions will ensure clinical interoperability and that we can exchange information out of one EHR system into another for care coordination. So it's important that we try to ensure everybody understands the scope of the problem we're trying to solve, because within healthcare, there are many. Everyone wants to talk about devices. The FDA has a lot of things going on right now with medical devices and ensuring interoperability. Well, some of those devices do exchange messages, and some of them directly into the EHR. We can definitely support testing that. Can we test how somebody wears their Fitbit? No, that's not what we do. But we are anxious and wanting to work with people to recognize what types of testing are out there beyond just interoperability of messages, just so that people know how things are being tested when they're being tested.
No, it's a great point. I mean, it's important to know the scope of what you're dealing with. Jimmy brings up a good point, though. I should bring on, I think they're called usability people. That's the company that focuses just on the usability. So, I mean, if we, today we're focusing on interoperability. Future Blab, I could easily see talking about usability since it is a major problem. In fact, we just did a workflow one last week. So we'd have workflow, interoperability, and usability. That would be a good triumvirate. I think the thing that annoys people about interoperability and some of this discussion is that, we've had years and years of certification. I mean, every organization knows that they need to buy a certified EHR. EHR vendors have poured tons of money into EHR certification, into other certifications. I mean, HIMSS came out with the concert certification, which a few vendors have done, but why haven't those certification programs worked? What does it take to make a good certification when it comes to interoperability?
So that is a great question, John. So I want to first talk about meaningful use certification. And you don't have to just follow Mario. Anybody who is interested, do a Google search on the American Medical Association, the AMA. They wrote a letter to Karen DeSalvo. It's very Googleable. You can find it out there. If anybody needs help, they can send me an email. And the AMA asked ONC why so many of the certified products were demonstrating that they weren't safe for patients. Mm-hmm. And basically, that concern was echoed out there. What people need to recognize is that ONC's focus on the ATB, the accredited testing bodies and the meaningful use certification program that exists today that is certifying EHRs that we are required to buy, they're certified for the collection of ECQM, the electronic clinical quality measures. They are not tested for the rigors to ensure that they do manage patient safety, that they recognize when duplicate prescriptions are sent, that they do recognize when there's a slip and fall that happens and somebody's brought in, that maybe the patient that's in ER is the son or the father of somebody who has the exact same name. And really what we're trying to do is check in another person, John Smith, with the same name because it's senior and junior. There's a lot of different issues with respect to, quote, interoperability and making sure that systems are ready for certification. But any certification program, and this is what we'll talk about at HIMSS, any certification program that wants to launch or get started needs to ensure that the testing program that it is based upon has the rigors to ensure that people can do continuous testing. Because once a product is certified, once a vendor says this product is certified, there needs to be techniques where they can do continuous testing, that they can demonstrate surveillance, that the ATB, the accredited testing bodies, are surveilling those vendors continuously. Very few vendors will certify a system against a particular version and then launch that version. They're making constant changes. They're making feature enhancements. They're integrating new services in. And unless they want to continue to run back to the certifying bodies to get recertified, which is very expensive, it's not fair to the vendors. It's not fair to the certification programs, because they're not considering how they're going to test. And what I will talk about at HIMSS, and what I encourage everybody who's listening or does listen to this, is ensure that these testing programs are open, that people can see the test cases, that EHR vendors and university programs and anyone who wants to run these tests can run them anytime, anywhere. And then by virtue of doing that, because we're doing the testing anyway, the certification processes begin to leverage that testing. And then everybody can certify a product the same way. And then the burden of coming back and surveilling any EHR vendor is only a matter of looking and seeing how they last or when they last tested. And there's considerable cost savings in that approach.
You know, I mean, it's interesting. Mario and I, we've talked many times, and the concept of continuous testing that we've discussed multiple times. But I think most people listening probably didn't process exactly what you meant. And I think the challenge with most of these certifications is they're point certifications. You go one time, you test it, and then you go back to the office. And then when they implement it into the environment, into the organization, things change. Or they do an upgrade and then things change, but they don't have to go back to the certifying body for whatever reason, right? Depending on the certification requirements. And so the concept of continuous testing is that for every upgrade that an EHR vendor does, you have a way to test it against, and you're much better at this than I am, but the happy cases, as I think you call them, right? So, everything goes well, they do submit the right format, everything works. But then all of the not happy cases, which I don't know how you would call those, but the not happy cases where they send the wrong information or where it's partially submitted or where all of those things. And you need to do that on a continuous basis. Otherwise, you have the reality that so many have experienced in healthcare that they are certified EHRs. They're certified on one EHR vendor, maybe even the same EHR vendor, and yet they can't share the information across.
These are great lessons learned. They're being seen and replicated across the industry, and it's unfortunate. It's not necessary. So if you were to look at and really drill down, EHR vendors do testing. I don't want to infer that they're not doing testing. And some of them have very good quality programs. They really do care. But the challenge
standard across the EHRs, right? I mean, because
now you need the robustness. You need a robustness of testing across organizations. And a lot of people will admit that that's rather difficult technically to do. That's why organizations like the IHE form something called the Connect-a-thon, where they bring organizations together. And that's good. 1 week a year is at least what they can do, but that's the problem. 1 week a year. We need the Connect-a-thon to almost be virtual, to be able to run 24/7, 365. And there's really, if we can get to an approach where we're sponsor-based and somebody can help an organization like Aegis or anyone write the testing, then we can make that freely available. And by doing that, we can make sure that the academia, the universities, the students, we can push that down into the organizations that are actually writing the code so that they can test all the time. And the reason you want to do that is because from any software development lifecycle perspective, finding a bug early is beneficial. And we want to encourage people to make sure these systems that they're putting out there will be as high quality and interoperable as possible. And, I'll put a call out to HIMSS. We're going to be at the HIMSS National Conference. Our booth number is 12949. Please come by and visit us. We'd love to continue to talk interoperability.
We're right outside the Interoperability Showcase.
Yes.
Excellent. And Richard, so is this what you're doing with FHIR and the Touchstone platform is really creating that continuous testing environment?
Yeah, definitely. We launched Touchstone right before the Connect-a-thon 10 event back in October of last year. And so it was very well received at the FHIR Connect-a-thon event. And so people tested, did like the patient track, terminology track, if you're familiar with that format. But then after the Connect-a-thon was done, everybody's on their own and they head off, right? Well, no, we saw people coming back to Touchstone and continuing their testing. And so it wasn't just at a single event, it was continuous, it was ongoing. And as we approach the next Connect-a-thon, FHIR Connect-a-thon this past January, we added new tests. We started to support more of the test tracks that were out there. So not only patient terminology, but there was a whole plethora of testing tracks that came online. CDS, clinical decision support, lab order, and so on. And so I was working with the track leads coming up with test scripts, which are now a required part of doing a test track at the FHIR Connect-a-thon. And so now we can host those in Touchstone, and people can start to test even before the Connect-a-thon to start trying out their systems. During the Connect-a-thon, see what their results are while they're there, and then even afterwards, and continue on with that testing. We've seen a lot of uptick in people coming to Touchstone lately and realizing that I don't have to be at a Connect-a-thon. I don't have to be at a specific event. I can just log in, I can register, I can set up my system, choose whatever tests I want, get immediate feedback, figure out what's going on wrong, and then start to fix it. And we're seeing great examples of people that come in, run a test, and let's say 6 out of 7 fail. Okay, and then they keep going, and it's like, oh, now I'm up to 5 failures or 2 successes, right? And they start seeing more and more green happening. And that's really what test-driven development is all about, is you start to look at where you're not hitting the mark and you're seeing where the errors are, and then you can go back in with the appropriate feedback and say, oh, I missed something here, let me go fix that, and then rerun the test and get immediate feedback and see how you're doing. So it's a great example of how we're promoting that continuous testing for this industry.
And I'd like to jump in here just for one quick second. One of the things that's important when we're looking at how to test these systems that Touchstone brings in is the ability to support multiple actors. So we can actually do very complex workflows where we're doing care coordination between multiple FHIR servers and multiple FHIR clients. And we can all engage with all those different organizations in a single test case where we can watch that workflow happen. And if everybody does their job, then everybody passes. If there's a problem, then we have to look and focus and figure out how that workflow wasn't supported. So I believe that this is a very powerful way to ensure that a standard is being implemented universally in an interoperable way. That is what HL7 is doing right with FHIR, and that's what Aegis is doing with Touchstone to help that.
So, I mean, that's really what I think we need to get to. But certainly some interoperability nerds will join and watch this, right? But, you know, from a real practical perspective, right? If I'm a CIO that has an EHR, and let's say I have an Epic EHR that's tested FHIR against, you know, the Touchstone platform, and then my colleague across the way has a Cerner system that's tested against Touchstone platform. If they've both tested, can we reliably share data across that without concern that there will be issues?
That is the intent. And one step further is when either of those organizations consider upgrading, they should know that those products have been tested in a backwards compatible and a future-proofing way. And the key to that is to recognize that as an industry, we do not move in lockstep. Having events where we come together and we all test the same version of a standard really isn't putting interoperability to the test. In the real world, one hospital system, another hospital system are using different versions of the standards, different implementations. And whether one particular vendor happens to be on the ball and update and has the latest version going today, most organizations are not. So we have to ensure that we recognize that to test interoperability, we have to test multiple versions. We have to test all versions that are in use to ensure that. And if we don't, if we stop being interoperable with a legacy version of a standard, then it is a responsibility of the vendor to be able to communicate that. Your EHR system will no longer talk this version of a Cerner or an Epic or and I don't mean to pick on any particular EHR because they're all based on standards at a point in time. One of the analogies I use is interoperability is a point in time. It is continuous interoperability that we want to achieve. And only the solutions that can ensure they recognize when standards change and those systems out there are conforming to different versions and they're able to consume them in a robustness principle way, then we'll have scalable, continuous interoperability. Until then, we have interoperability, but it can be fragile at times.
Are there any, so I understand why you want to be careful mentioning EHR vendors, but are there any that you could proclaim as doing this across all of their versions of their EHR that are being in use or, you know, that are communicating well if they choose not to? I mean, we see that in the same in WordPress, right? WordPress communicates to me on the blogging platforms, we no longer support PHP, whatever version, and so you need to be updated, right? So
yes.
It's the same principle, right? Are there any EHR vendors that are doing this today that are really pushing it forward?
So I would say that if there were any that approached us and were testing with Touchstone and or the DIL, the Developers Integration Lab, and they allowed me to talk about them publicly, I would. Right now, what I would say is the Sequoia project, as an example, is a functioning national exchange. But if you go to that organization and you navigate their webpage under the eHealth Exchange, you'll see that they support two versions of the standard, 2010 and 2011. But if you look at the participants of those exchanges, they either support one version or the other version or both. Well, why do they have to say that? They have to say that because those versions of the standards represent breaking change. There is a significant amount of changes between 1 year that causes them to not be interoperable. Well, if that's happening and the eHealth Exchange recognizes it, then why don't we recognize that with other standards and other approaches to testing? They all have these challenges. What we're not doing is educating people on how to look for them, recognize them. And you talked about the CIO. The CIO cares about the implementation and the operations. They do care. It's the CFO who I want to reach because the CFO cares about how much this costs. And you really want to choose carefully which vendors you're investing in, because they become part of your financial bottom line. And how well they maintain the quality of the systems means how much the organization can mitigate that risk of interoperability. Because remember, interoperability is not just about your organization. It's about your organization able to interoperate with everyone else out there within your regional or national care setting.
And is that what it's really going to take to have this take off? Is the CIO, but also the CFO getting involved and saying, we want you as our EHR vendor, or we've purchased you and spent billions of dollars or hundreds of millions or lots of money. We want you to be interoperable and do continuous testing so that I can exchange data. Like, if we don't have that, will this really become a reality?
So it is a challenge. I believe that the EHR vendors are doing the best job they can. There's a lot of pressure around meaningful use and all these different programs that they're trying to adhere to. And I believe that, yes, the CFOs in their contract language, and this is what the Center for Medicare Interoperability is trying to do, and other organizations to help these CFOs write contracts to ensure that when they go out to market, so when the members of those organizations go out with RFPs, they have common language that really holds the EHR vendor accountable for delivering solutions. Because if you were to listen to the AHA just talk about this, they talk about how the EHR vendor is almost immune to any interoperability issues, because who is the one that pays the penalty? Well, it's the provider, it's the hospitals that are running these EHRs. Well, they don't know what level of testing is going on. And if you were to sit down with an EHR vendor, not naming anyone in particular, and just say, hey, what's your testing? They would say, we do good testing. Trust us. And then from there, if you push them any further, they would come back with, we do industry level testing. Okay, stop that.
What's that mean?
Everybody has functional requirements. Everybody should have a requirements traceability matrix. Everyone should be writing test cases against how they're going to test their EHR. And then there's only one question left. What's your coverage? Do you have 60% coverage? If anyone says they have 100% coverage, only NASA has 100% test coverage. And in order to support NASA's 100% test coverage, they spend on average 500% of the program cost on testing. No one's going to do 100%.
And by coverage, you mean that you've covered all of the bad cases, right?
If you claim that you have 100% test coverage, then you have recognized all of the out of bounds conditions, all the errors, all the exceptions. We call those edge cases.
Right.
They sit out there on the periphery, and they're very rare to happen. But if they happen, it's important to know what your system does. So, you talk about the vendors doing a level of testing, but the implementers and the implementations that go into hospital systems, they have to retest those systems there too. We don't want people who are buying EHRs that are COTS products to feel that all the testing is done. We have a very large federal agency that just awarded a multi-billion-dollar EHR acquisition. And while that is a COTS product and the COTS solution is well tested, that federal agency still owns the responsibility to ensure that the system that's being delivered is tested in the environment it's intended to be used. So I really hope they recognize the risk that they hold, and they cannot transfer that risk to a COTS vendor because it's a COTS product.
Well, and it goes back to, you need to really do the continuous testing across multiple products. Otherwise, you can just share internally, but not externally.
Exactly. And most of these federal agencies are required to ensure they're able to support interoperability both with themselves, other federal agencies, and then ultimately all the public healthcare clinics and healthcare providers out there.
Well, they'll need to as that changes. So, we're getting close to the end. In fact, we've gone over our time because we enjoy the topic so much. But Richard, where's you started Touchstone project with FHIR? What's the big vision? Where are you taking this testing platform? What's going to be the pathway going forward?
So the fact that we have FHIR as the initial specification, we chose that because we saw within FHIR the capabilities that we've already discussed. So the test resource itself is a FHIR resource. The definition of it, though, is extensible even beyond just the FHIR specification. It is a definition of how to run a test, and how you define the assertions, the rules that you're going to execute against the resources, the request response messages that go back and forth. So we're taking Touchstone beyond FHIR. FHIR is the initial specification, but we have plans to branch out and incorporate into Touchstone additional specifications, as needs are dictated, as we come across those standards. So we've had plenty of experience with, as Mario suggested, the eHealth Exchange. So those are the Nationwide Health Information Network standards. We have very good experience with the IHE standards, the PICS PDQ, XDS, the Cross Gateway standards as well. So we're going to be looking at those standards to incorporate them as well as other industries. I mean, this isn't just a healthcare industry related, issue that we're talking about. Healthcare happens to be where we're at right now, but you can think of any other space out there. Think of securities exchange. Think of, just think of any other industry where you're exchanging data securely and you want to ensure that you have conformance to the specification. So we can leverage this platform against other industry standards as well.
Well, no doubt healthcare is not alone in the problem of sharing data, even though, I often quote one of the first things Mario told me that, because I asked Mario, one of my first questions, I said, is healthcare data really more complex than financial industry? And Mario said to me, and this is my quote, hopefully it still applies, but it'll be interesting to see if it doesn't. But he told me, he said, it's an order of magnitude more complex than financial data, which, I thought was a good description of the challenge of healthcare data versus financial data. Is that still true, Mario?
Absolutely. Everyone thinks about the ATM card and how it always works no matter where they travel in the world.
Yep.
An ATM transaction is but 12 pieces of data. And yes, it works. Many people don't know that the World Banking Organizations have spent more than $3 billion testing that 12 pieces of information. We have not spent that much on testing in health IT. So yes, it is exponentially more complex. And what's leading to that complexity is a lack of a national patient identifier, dependence on patient matching, the ability to ensure that we're doing patient consent policies correctly. So there's a number of different challenges that I can go through or could in future discussions go through. But yes, it is very complex data that we're trying to share.
Yeah, having worked with it intimately for a while now under Mario's direction, I agree wholeheartedly with that. Just looking at the FHIR specification, just the amount of energy that has gone into defining these resources. The initial specification, draft 1, had about 50 resource types. We're now up to close to 100, crossing over multiple clinical domains. Just the patient resource itself is way beyond just 12 data elements. So there is, I would call it even like two orders of magnitude in complexity greater than what you think of in just the financial world.
Wow. Well, like Mario said, we could talk for a long time, so I'm sure we'll have you back as this interoperability discussion continues. I heard one person say interoperability would be the buzzword that at HIMSS that nobody cares about, or that was overhyped, the overhyped buzzword at HIMSS. But regardless, people are trying to solve this, and I think that's true with the reimbursement challenges that are coming. We have to find a way to share the data and really search for that kind of healthcare interoperability nirvana, right? The right data at the right place at the right time. We need that, even though there's pressures not to do that.
Yeah, I think some of the challenges that organizations ran into is they started to represent that interoperability was solved. And they created a premise that if we demonstrate it, if we can showcase it, if we show it, it must be solved. And that, I think, the industry, even with ONC, providing a roadmap for the next 10 years, and the EHI initiative writing their roadmap. Both of these initiatives demonstrate that interoperability is still a road that we're headed down. We're not there yet, and it's not a race. We're not going to get to the end of it and all of a sudden be there. HSPC and Stan Huff talk about how it's a continuous process. We will need to ensure that we are continuously interoperable.
Yeah. Stan Huff from Intermountain, he knows about this as they're trying to do it with FHIR. So great stuff. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining live. I want to thank my special guests, Mario Hyland, Senior Vice President and Founder at Aegis.net, and Richard Ettema, Senior Lead Developer at Aegis.net. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm John Lynn. If you want to find the recording of this video, you can check it out at healthcarescene.com. Check out our network of sites where we'll post this video and many others. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We'll be back next time to talk more healthcare IT.